Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the second Sunday in Lent, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the second Sunday in Lent are Jeremiah 26, 8 through 15, Psalm 4, Philippians 3:17 through 4:1, and Luke 13:31 to 35. I'm not entirely going to talk about the readings today, though. Instead, I'm going to talk about something that the prophet Jeremiah talks about just before the reading from Jeremiah today, a place called Shiloh. In the reading for Jeremiah, the leaders of Jerusalem are angry at him. They're so angry, in fact, that they are threatening to arrest and maybe even kill him. But what is it that made them so angry? Well, Jeremiah said that Jerusalem would become like Shiloh. But what is Shiloh? Apparently, by Jeremiah's time, Shiloh had become the standard reference for a place that was destroyed for being wicked. Kind of like how we will say that a place far away is, well, Egypt or Timbuktu or something like that. Jeremiah's message to the leaders of Jerusalem was, if you don't listen to God or follow the instructions that God has given, if they don't listen, well, then this temple will become a ruin like Shiloh, and the city will be made a curse before all the nations on earth. This somewhat understandably made the officials of Judah angry, and that's what led to Jeremiah being arrested and threatened to be killed. But what is Shiloh? What is this place, and what happened there to make it so destructive? Shiloh is first mentioned in Joshua 18 as a place where the people would gather to worship the Lord. It was the home of God's tabernacle, the tent of God from the book of Exodus. And in the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant of Raiders of the Lost Ark fame, and the representation of God's presence in the world. Over the years, Shiloh grew into a major religious center and the main place of worship for the Israelite people. There's even some thinking in the textual criticism world of biblical studies that Shiloh is where the Deuteronomist and Elohist texts of the Torah come from. I'm not going to unpack all of what that means, but if you want to look up the documentary hypothesis, which has fallen in and out of favor over the past couple years, you can look that up to find out more info. By the time of the events of the books of Samuel, Shiloh was the place for worshiping God. Jerusalem had not yet been captured. That wouldn't happen until the time of King David. And Shiloh then was where everyone would gather to offer sacrifices to God, because that's where God's tent was. They would also go and have their disputes heard by the priests if there was an argument about land or property or anything like that. At the beginning of 1 Samuel, the priest at Shiloh was named Eli, and he had two sons who Scripture calls worthless men. They didn't obey God's law, they slept with the women who came to worship, and they judged unfairly. And then Eli didn't really do anything to rein his sons in. So God, through an unnamed prophet and a child prophet named Samuel, the namesake of the books, proclaimed that because of their misdeeds, Eli and his sons would soon die. Some time passed, and the people of Israel set out to battle the Philistines, a neighboring group of people. The Israelites were losing the battle, and so they decided to bring God into the fight. They sent to Shiloh for the Ark of the Covenant, and Eli's 2 sons went with the Ark. When the Ark got to the battlefield, Israel celebrated because God was now with them, and they were sure to win. Well, the Philistines heard Israel's celebration, but instead of fleeing in terror, they rallied, and they defeated the Israelites, who were apparently more than a little bit overconfident. And worst of all, much to Israel's horror, the Philistines captured God's ark. In the meantime, word came back to Eli at Shiloh that not only was the ark captured, but both of his sons had died in the fighting as well. On hearing it, Eli fell out of his chair and broke his neck. Scripture tells us it was because Eli was really fat, and in doing so fulfilled the prophecy of the death of Eli and his sons. Meanwhile, the Philistines were exceptionally happy. They had not just defeated the people of Israel, but the God of Israel. That was how things worked back then. They had victory over the same God who had humiliated the Egyptians during the Exodus. And so the Philistines took the Ark of God, remember this symbol of God's presence, and lay it at the feet of the statue of their god, named Dagon. They were quite excited that their god Dagon was obviously better than Israel's God. But the next morning, they came into Dagon's temple and they saw Dagon had fallen down. It's a little odd, but whatever. So they set Dagon back up, went about their day. But the next morning, Dagon had fallen down again. Only this time, the head and hands of the statue had been chopped off and set on the threshold of the temple. It got even worse the next day. The people of Ashdod, the town that the ark had been taken to, were afflicted by what scripture seems to call tumors on their secret parts. We don't entirely know what that means. Some translators have kind of taken it as incredibly aggressive hemorrhoids, or maybe a weird STD, or with some other descriptions like the presence of rats that come up later, it might actually refer to something like the bubonic plague. So the Philistines panic, and they decide to send the ark away from Ashdod to a different Philistine city, this one called Gath, maybe hoping that the power of Dagon would be greater there or something. But no, when the ark gets to Gath, there were more tumors. And they moved it to another city, Ekron, but the same thing. Then they were kind of getting desperate. They didn't want to take it to the other cities, Gaza or Ashkelon, and they were just kind of done with the whole thing. So they decided that they were going to commit the classic move of ditching the problem on your neighbor's doorstep. And that's what they did. They made a guilt offering, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden rats, one for each of the major Philistine cities, and sent the whole thing back to Israel. They went to the border and ditched the tumors, the rats, and the ark at a town called Beit Shemesh. But the people of Beit Shemesh got a little bit too curious. They looked in the ark, which was a bit more than a no-no. There was some more death. And then the ark ended up in a town called Kiryat Jearim, because apparently Shiloh got caught up in the destruction of the Philistine victory at the beginning of the story, and so the ark couldn't go back there. We don't know from scripture when exactly Shiloh was destroyed, but we know that the ark didn't go back there ever, and instead stayed at Kiryat Jearim for decades, until King David brought the ark to Jerusalem after he captured it early in his reign. Shiloh isn't mentioned again, aside from the prophecy in Jeremiah and a guy named Ahiah the Shilonite who gets mentioned in 1 Kings. Otherwise, it's just gone. And that might be why Jeremiah references it to say to the leaders of Jerusalem, if you don't want to end up like Shiloh, you better shape up. Of course, the leaders of Jerusalem don't shape up, and Jerusalem is sacked and nearly destroyed by the Babylonians not long after Jeremiah's prophecy. All because they didn't do what God wanted, to turn back to the true worship of God as expressed through not being jerks to the poor. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.